Welcome back to the Beast Machines episode reviews. We are on number 6 now, Discovery, which is actually Revelations Part 1. This is the beginning of a 3-part series, and when I've been telling you about the pacing of Beast Machines and when it tries so hard to push out as much story as fast as possible, remember that this is a series that's 26 episodes long, and yet it has 4 3-parters. That's a rushed pace, just to let you know. That is a rushed pace. This is the 3-parter where we're going to start getting a lot of answers to the questions that have been built up so far in the series, but not just yet. We're going to add a few more before we start getting some of those answers. This episode is twofold. It is a contentious relationship between a Optimus Primal who is retaking command but still not quite right in the head, and Cheetor's issues not only with his debate over following Primal versus his own instincts, which is that Primal's misleading them right now or isn't in his right head. And then the other part is between Thrust and Blackarachnia, because for some reason Thrust just keeps saving her life even though he's supposed to be capturing her spark. So the episode starts with, hey, guess what? You know how we always get like a random chase sequence in between, like the Viacons randomly stumbling across the Maximals and initiating a chase sequence fight? We just start with a chase sequence in this one. So we kind of cut to the chase. They're down in the catacombs of Cybertron again. And in this time, to get away from the Viacons, Primal hits on the idea of blasting a coolant tank chamber in order to like flood everyone out. And it works. I mean, it works. It saves them. It saves them for the moment. However, there's something of an allegory going on in this episode. The point of this episode is to kind of push Primal away from what he's been doing recently and get him back into his survivor guilt mode. And there's going to be a few elements to do that. So the big element to that is breaking the coolant loose and is going to cause a chain reaction that we're going to see throughout this episode. More than once, Jetstorm gets blasted off like Team Rocket because some vent is burst. As whatever Primal just burst the cooling unit on is starting to overheat. And what he's actually, what's overheating is a factory where Megatron stripped a lot of Transformers of their sparks. Now we do get a revelation with that, in that Rat Trap does notice that there's no carbon scoring around the spark chambers, which means the spark didn't extinguish. You know, like they had just been plain up killed. No. This is the first time they actually discover that the sparks were taken, which means there is hope for saving Cybertron. And this is one of the first times where they actually get that hope. Now, I mentioned this is part of the Survivor Guild. So, because Primal burst the coolant unit to the factory where all these, thousands upon thousands of Cybertronian sparkless corpses were strewn about, he's set off a chain reaction that's going to detonate the entire place. And we see that. The whole the episode finishes with the entire factory exploding, which means thousands of now that they know the sparks have survived, thousands of Cybertronians now have no body to return to once their sparks have freed. And that is a chain reaction caused by Primal's earlier choice. It is supposed to tie back into his own choices with the Beast Wars, where because Primal made the wrong decision before, it caused this reaction that led to Megatron taking over Cybertron. So we're re-establishing that aspect of the character and his story arc in dealing with being a survivor and what he perceives to be his mistakes of the past, and seeing them unfold again through this factory. It's not a bad way of getting them back to what Primal's struggle through this series is going to be. Just not only a level of survivor's guilt, but also just a feeling of failure. And okay, if that's what you're going for with Primal, that's fine. And it starts to reinforce what they're doing with Cheetor, which is, now that he's led the Maximals for a little bit, he kind of has his own way of doing things, and he's got it in his head that the way Primal's acting and the choices he's been making just shows that he's not ready to retake command yet. And by the end of the episode, Cheetor is going to demand to take back leadership of the Maximals, even though Primal is, back to full power. It's a pretty big moment. This is the culmination of Cheetor's entire story arc from the beginning of Beast Wars, where he's just this kid looking to impress Optimus Primal, to now where he's matured enough to see Primal's faults, especially now handling this situation, and he feels that he can handle this better. So it's a big growth episode for Cheetor. Now, I'd like to say this goes to good places, but the truth is, after this episode, Cheetor doesn't really have a lot to do outside of being second in command, or for a while, the leader of the Maximals. I don't know, it feels like lost opportunity. It just feels like they cut to the chase a little bit too quick on Cheetor's arc, to the point where I really would like to see him as leader longer. But we'll get into that in future episodes. The weird part about this episode is the Blackarachnia and Thrust part, because he's constantly saving her from situations in this episode, including where both of them get caught by a giant spark extractor, which, by the way, is the first time we've noticed that the Maximal sparks are now uniquely colored. They're not all just standard blue sparks anymore. So when Thrust saves Blackarachnia from that situation, at the cost of his own spark, by the way, even Thrust does not exactly know what's going on. He says he's starting to have memories, and he's starting to have visions of what Blackarachnia looked like back on Earth. So at this point, Blackarachnia assumes that the spark powering Thrust is that of Silverbolt. Why else would he be going out of his way to save her? Which is a good way, because of course there's going to be a twist to this later on. If you know the series, you know the twist. But once the twist happens, you look back on this episode and go, well, now this just seems really random and weird. Like, now this doesn't really make sense. So, I mean, it's a twofold thing. In the moment, it creates good intrigue. And it gives Blackarachnia an overall goal, which is now to try and get Silverbolt out of Thrust, or at least try to reawaken his memories so he remembers who he used to be. Okay, so we'll see how that goes during the course of this three-parter. But for now, it is bizarre, because it does kind of come out of nowhere. But at the very least, it adds something to Thrust, because frankly, between Tankor being so imposing and having an episode where he got to shine, and Jetstorm literally stealing the episode every time he's in there, this episode no different. By the way, this is the episode where he drops a Pokemon reference of all things. Because of all that, it is nice that Thrust gets a little bit of a spotlight. Because from here on out, we're really gonna Tankor is gonna get a really different spotlight on him. So yeah, there's a lot of things. There's a lot to handle in this episode. They're telling two different stories at once, and neither one of them's actually being told badly here. It's also notable that this episode doesn't really require Megatron at all either. That doesn't mean that this episode is flawless or anything. We get to see how much of a vampire Night Scream is, where he can siphon Energon and use it to heal himself. Little creepy, but hey, it's unique. It works for him. We see Blackarachnia has a much more sincere side to herself. She actually sheds a tear. So, the femme fatale from Beast Wars is basically completely gone at this point. And she's going to enter a phase where she just needs to get Silverbolt back. That's going to be her story arc for the rest of the series, now that she thinks she knows where Silverbolt is. Other weirdness in this episode. Rat Trap, we just established, is not the weak component of the Maximal team, but he is shown to be entirely helpless at the beginning of this episode, which is not a great look. So I feel like they kind of missed the point there. At least no one's harassing him too badly over it. More just poking fun at him. Let's see. reading through my notes here. There's a lot of sections here where they use anime speed lines, and I couldn't. I mean, there's a stylized choice to it in this series, of course, but they're using it here in a way that almost makes me feel like there's some kind of technological limitation, because it's doing so when they're trying to run through Cybertron, and it makes me realize that they probably didn't have a massive city of Cybertron animated out. So now I'm just kind of realizing a lot of those speed lines are replacing parts where they'd be running through the city, which might not be big enough for them to run through at their speed. Or it might actually be compensating for the fact they might not be able to animate the characters moving through the city at the speed that they want for the scene. Either way, it's a weird style choice in this one. And it's like really present here too. I think the big twist that we get in this episode is now we basically know that the Viacon generals have familiar sparks. They're not sure who it is yet, but it adds a different level of threat to them, even though they're kind of starting to become a little bit silly for how many times they've failed to capture the Maximals. Now they're at a point where, no, we can't destroy these three because we might be destroying our friends, which is a really sinister trick for Megatron to pull. So credit to him. I mean, it's a good twist, even if it does lead to some problems later on. But we'll get to those once we talk about those episodes. So just reading real quick. Overall, I'm going to give it an enjoyable score. I mean, for the culmination of Cheetor's arc, setting up some of the mysteries that we're going to unravel throughout the next three-parter, it's not a bad start, and it creates an interesting set of scenes, especially seeing Thrust and Blackarachnia together. I would say at this point, I will let you know that, as I said before, I watched through this series with a friend of mine, and I'll be honest, if I wasn't taking notes the first time we ran through it, I really wouldn't be able to tell you what happened in this episode. I really wouldn't. Just by the name of the episode alone, I could not remember what happened, because I don't know if it's because the plot is so dense, or I think it's because so many episodes just feel the same. Like, even in this episode, there's another scene where the Viacons randomly ambush the Maximals, even though they're in beast mode. So that whole thing flew out the window. So there's weirdness. There's still weirdness going on, and there's still like an overfamiliarity. There's way too much formula to what happens in this series, especially during season 1. Season 2 changes a little bit, but for now, like, the episodes are just starting to feel way too familiar. They're all doing a lot of stuff, but they're all doing it in the same setting, in the same way, and the same events are happening over and over, and it really does start to just get repetitive overall. Still, enjoyable for what it set up. Enjoyable for a Beast Machines episode. So, there you go. That's part 1 of Discovery. That's part 1 of Revelations, Discovery. Next up, Revelations Part 2, Descent. We'll be talking about that tomorrow, so join me then.
It's the bosun's turn. He's looking at TJ's character, and he's just like, what you gonna do?
Right. I blew him a kiss.
I love him. I love him.
What's your problem? He's just gonna pull his can crossbow and just fire at you.
That's fair at this point.